Good morning, everyone, or good afternoon, depending on where you are in the world. Today's tutorial is going to be about using the Luxrender or the StructureSynth to Luxrender exporter. We're going to be taking a look at a couple of things here today. We're going to take a look at how to download the exporter, the installation, conventions used for the exporter. We're going to take a look at how to prepare your scene for export to Luxrender, how to actually export from StructureSynth, and then we're going to be preparing the scene, the Luxrender scene for export. Okay, then we're also going to take a look at how to get depth of field information out of StructureSynth, and we're going to take a look at lighting as well. We've got a lot to cover today, so go ahead and please follow along. Also have fun with this. And we're going to get started here right away. So the first thing is we're going to need to download the exporter to install into StructureSynth. Go ahead and take a look at the link that you have there flashing across your screen now. If you don't have a chance to write it down, you can go ahead and take a look at this link just below the video here, and just click on that and you'll come to a page. This one in particular, where you can download it right here, StructureSynth to Luxrender Exporter version 1.0. Okay, now let's get back to StructureSynth itself. But first we need to install it. Okay, once we've got it downloaded, we're going to need to install this. We need to find out, or we need to know where our installation path is to StructureSynth. Now I'm using a Mac, so for me it's fairly easy. I have it installed here in my StructureSynth folder. When you open that folder up, you're going to come up with this here. You've got your application, you've got an examples folder, you've got your GPL licenses, and we've got a miscellaneous folder. We're going to double click on that. And that's going to bring up this. This gives us all the different importers or exporters for StructureSynth. And you can see you've got Sunflow here. You've got a RenderMan. You've got two Pavres. You've got a couple of Blender templates here. These don't work. These are for Blender 2.49. I am working on getting these two fixed and hopefully have these out in a couple of weeks. And then you've also got an Appleseed render template. So what we're going to need to do is simply add our render template in here. Okay, I've already got it installed, so I'm not going to go ahead and install it here. This is a different installation place, but I've got it here, and we're all set to go. So once we get it installed, we now need to know where to find this out. However, before we move on, if you don't know where your installation, what your installation path is, or you don't know where it's installed or anything, you can find out easily by going up here, clicking on Export, Template Export, and it comes up with this dialog box. Okay, if you look here, this is the installation path to your StructureSynth folder. You just take a look at this and you can find it easily, okay? And then all you have to do is look in the miscellaneous folder. We're going to close this real quick because we're going to look at some other things first. Okay. Now, there are some things that we need to know when we're working with a Eisen script, which is the scripting language for StructureSynth, and when we're creating a scene for our or for export to Luxrender. So if you look over here, this is an Eisen script. Okay, this is an Eisen script here, and this basically has all the information to create this scene. Now, what you see here, spheres colon shiny, excuse me. This is going to give us what type of primitive we're going to use. and what type of material we're going to use. This is what comes by default in StructureSynth. Okay, this isn't going to work for Luxrender. So in this case, we're going to use a sphere, and as you can see here, we're using spheres. But we want to change, we want to get a glossy or a shiny type material. So we're going to put in here for Luxrender, glossy. Now, there are some different conventions that Luxrender uses, and let's take a look at those here. We've got several different materials. We've got 5 actually. We've got a matte material, a glossy material, a glass material, a metal material, and a car paint material. These are all the different materials for Luxrender that StructureSynth is going to support. Like you saw earlier over here, the syntax we're going to use is primitive : material. So it'll be, as in this case here, sphere, and then we choose one of these, : glossy, matte, glass, metal, car paint. Also, there are 3 different, actually 4 different primitives that StructureSynth can export to Luxrender. Let's take a look at those. You've got your box, so if we add a material on, it'd be box : matte, or glossy, or glass, or metal, car, as you can see here. For the sphere, they're the same materials, and you can see examples of them here. Now, for the grid, we actually have a grid primitive, but it's not the type of grid you're thinking about in Blender. It's a different type of grid. This is basically a box, a hollow box, and maybe we'll take a look at that in just a second. But you have 2 different versions, a thick and a thin version. So you've got grid. The thin version is actually default. So grid is going to default to the thin, and you have your same 5 materials. And then grid, if we want to use the thick one, we're going to use grid : matte thick, glossy thick, glass thick, metal thick, car thick. And you can experiment with these to see which one fits into your scene the best. Okay, so now that we've got that out of the way, you've seen again here that we put in sphere : glossy. Okay, we know that sphere is one of our primitives that we can export to Luxrender, and we know that glossy is one of the Luxrender materials as well. Now here, what's going on here? All we have here is a primitive with no material. If I leave this and I run the Eisen script, it's going to produce the effect that you see here on your screen. However, when I go to export this, it's going to give me an error down here in the console, and it'll also give me an error when I go to export it. Okay, and we'll take a look at this in just a second. Now, why? Well, because this isn't something that Luxrender supports or the exporter supports. So again, in this case, before we knew this was sphere : shiny, which is a shiny or a glossy material that StructureSynth uses internally, and sphere alone is just a matte material that StructureSynth uses. So if we want to stay with the original, which we do, we're going to go ahead and use matte. Now, this will work. Okay, so we've got sphere glossy and sphere matte. Now, let's go ahead and see how we can really prepare this Eisen script for Luxrender. Another thing that we have to remember, and this is really true for all physically based renderers out there, is we don't ever want to put in RGB values of greater than 0.07, 0.08. Okay, always want to keep those. I'm sorry, 0.7 or 0.8. We want to always keep those values under 1. Now in this case, we can see that we've got our hue our saturation, but we don't have a value. Okay, so this will value out to 1, and this is going to be too bright for our renderer. This value is going to be too big for our renderer. In StructureSynth, it isn't called value. It's actually called brightness. So we need to add a B. And in this case, we want to put 0.7. Now we need to do this, again, like I said, we need to do this for the renderer, for Luxrender, because we don't want to have any values, any RGB values above this. And really, it's above 0.8, but I recommend 0.7, 0.75 at the high end. Okay, this is going to eliminate fireflies, and it's, you know, or at least it'll reduce the risk of having fireflies in your render. Now we need to do this for every single color value. So anytime we have a hue or color or anything remotely that has to do with color, we need to put in this clamp. Okay, and really what we're doing is we're just clamping the values down to 0.7. Okay, now we put in our two values in both of our two rules. If we were to hit build now, we're going to get an odd or funny result. So let's take a look at that. Build. Okay, now this isn't what we wanted, and this isn't really going to work out for us well. The problem is that we've put this into a recurring rule. So here the rule is going to call itself again, and it's going to continue to call itself until the max depth is hit, which is going to, you know, clamp the value down successively each time. So instead of putting this clamp in a recursive rule, let's move it down here where there is no recursion on this rule, and we're going to do the same for this one. This is just something to keep in mind and something you'll get used to as you gain more familiarity with EisenScript, and this is a problem with EisenScript. Okay, so we're going to put it down here where we have no recursion. Okay, the recursion happens up here and up here, but not down here. So now let's take a look and see what happens. Ah, okay, that's better. Now you do see that the colors have come out just a shade duller, if you will. There's really nothing wrong with that. Okay. Now in the beginning, we probably also noticed that there was at least this area here, and these parts were shiny. Well, that's because here we had the sphere : shiny material added. StructureSynth doesn't recognize glossy, so it's just putting everything in as matte. But when we get to Luxrender, this will render out to a nice glossy image. Also, another thing I want to mention here for the background, we have set the background in the EisenScript to white. Luxrender does not support different colored backgrounds. If you have a different color background, it's going to affect the total lighting of the scene. So you're going to have to, you're going to have to do backgrounds in post-production. Okay, you can, edit the alpha channel. The alpha channel is turned on by default for EXR images, so you don't have to worry about that. You automatically have an alpha channel in your EXR images if you decide to export them. Well, they'll actually be saved with the exporter by default. Okay, so now we've got this. We've got this set up, and everything is great here. Now we're ready to export. But before we do, I want to take a look at one last thing while we're here. Let's say we want to do depth of field. And as you can see, down here in the EisenScript, there's set ray tracer : depth of field, and you have here some numbers. This isn't going to do anything for us in Luxrender. This is for the internal StructureSynth renderer. However, we do need the depth of field information, or at least we need the focal distance information. So we want to choose. We're going to have to choose where we want to focus a shot. So what I need to do is I need to take my cursor and I need to find a point where I want to focus the camera. Let's say, just for clarity's sake, we want to focus here in the middle. So I set my cursor there, and I look down here, down in the lower left hand corner, and I can see a bunch of numbers. I got viewport depth, object sphere, it's telling me where I've got the cursor placed, and then we have camera plane depth, and this is the number that we want, camera plane depth. Now I'm going to put my cursor back up here, but pay attention to the camera plane depth number. Now you see it has changed to negative 36.3189. This is the number that we want to keep in mind. Write this down, remember it, whatever you like. But this is the number we're going to have to input in our focal distance. And let's take a look at that now. So now we've got all the information that we need. We've got everything that we need to go ahead and do the export. We're going to go up here to the File menu, and we're going to click on Export. You can also click on F6. And let's try that. F6 automatically brings up the export dialog box as it did before. Under the template drop-down, we want to select Luxrender version 1. This is where we installed this earlier on, and now we have it available to us here. There's a couple other things that we need to take a look at now. In our case, the default setting on this is output. So when you first open this and you go to export, your first export, it's going to default to output.lxs. If I were to select, let's say, POV, it'll default to output.pov. It's going to automatically change the extension here. So let's go back to Luxrender. And you can see it's changed the extension again. Now I suggest that for clarity's sake, you change this. And before I had it to swirls. I'm going to go ahead and save that as well. If I haven't saved my EisenScript yet, I can also select EisenScript, autosave EisenScript, and as you can see here, it'll save it with the same name. Okay, we're not going to worry about that now though. Another thing we want to take a look at here is our aspect ratio, or the dimensions of the scene. These are the dimensions of the scene. It's the width and the height, and we've locked in the ratio. This will automatically, or these two numbers are automatically going to get exported in the exporter. Now we can control this here, or we can control it here. As we extend this window, these dimensions will get bigger. So it's automatic. If I make this window bigger, these dimensions get bigger. If I make it smaller, the dimensions get smaller. And up here in the upper left-hand corner, you're going to see the resolution change as you go. Okay. For right now, we're just going to go ahead and leave it to this. Again, the exporter is going to take these digits and automatically insert them. Now, before we hit OK, we want to change one other thing. Let's go ahead and click on Modify, and that'll bring us to the actual template as we've saved it into the folder. Down here, we have a little checkbox. It's Modify Output Before Saving. And we do want to click on this before we hit OK. Now this is going to bring up a dialog box, which is going to allow us to edit the export that's coming out. Okay, and we're going to want to do this for a couple of reasons, and I'll show you when we hit OK. So again, we go from Settings to Modify, and we click on Modify Output Before Saving. Then we hit OK. Now I already have a file called swirls LXS. It asks me, do I want to overwrite the file? Yes, I do. And it brings me up the text editor, which I told you about before. And this is the actual file that's going to get saved, the actual .lxs file that is going to get saved. There are a few things that we want to go ahead and edit in here before we hit OK for the last time. The first one is the focal distance. If we want depth of field. Now you can see by default the focal distance is commented out. It's set to 0 as well. Please read this. Must be commented out and not set to 0. Do not have this uncommented and set to 0. It will crash Luxrender. Well, it'll actually go into a memory loop and just hog all your computer's resources, and you really do not want to see the outcome with this uncommented and set to 0. Now we saw our focal plane distance, which was negative 36, 0.3186. We're just going to leave it at 36 for now. So we'll enter that in between the brackets, and we're going to uncomment the focal distance because we do want that effect. And now it's going to compute, Luxrender will compute any blur, any focal blur that needs to be computed automatically. Something else that we want to edit is this here. This is the file name that Luxrender is going to output everything to. Now by default I have StructureSynth, structure_synth_LDR as the default. However, I would recommend changing this to something more akin to your file. So if you output a swirls.lxs, go ahead and output your PNG, your AXR, or anything like that to the same. So we're going to input here swirls as well. Again, this is going to output from Luxrender the file name. So anything coming out of Luxrender is going to be called swirls as well. It won't do that if you don't edit this. If you don't edit this and leave it, it's going to output to StructureSynth_LDR. And every time you create another .lxs scene with this exporter, if you don't change that, it's going to always output to StructureSynth.LDR, and it'll overwrite any other StructureSynth.LDR automatically without asking you. So remember to change this. Also, we have a number of settings here. All these are completely editable. Like I said before, we do have the alpha channel enabled on EXR images. So if you didn't want to output the alpha channel, just take away the A and leave as RGB. All of these are completely editable. Your surface integrators, if you want to use SPPM, if you want to use any other, for instance, sampler, you can use low discrepancy. If you want, you can go ahead and change those to your heart's content. Now, by default, we have a couple of, well, actually 3 different lighting schemes. The first lighting scheme is going to be just a studio setup, 2-lamp studio setup, okay? This is going to produce very nice renders onto a black background. With the alpha channel, you can go ahead and insert any background that you wish afterward. We can also use HDR images to create HDR lighting. By default, I have this commented out. HDR, as we all know, is quite a bit slower. So, you know, use this at your discretion. I have this commented out. If we want to use the HDR lighting, all we have to do is uncomment each line from attribute begin HDRI to attribute end. All of these need to be uncommented. Sorry. Also, in order to use this, we need to put our HDR file in the same folder as the .lxs file that we're going to export. In that case, if we do this, all we have to do is change this here, the file name, to whatever the file name of our HDR file is. If we don't have it in the same folder, then you need to put the complete path in between the quotes here. So that's our second option, is the HDR. We uncomment this and comment out all of this. From attribute begin main lamp to the second attribute end of the lamp 2. We comment all this out, and then all we're using is HDRI. Now we can also use both. And then in the Lux GUI, we can turn them on or off. However, they are going to both render, so it's going to increase your render time quite a bit. For now, we're not going to use HDR lighting. We're just going to stick to the studio setup because that's our default. And we're done. Editing, the LXS file. This is all there is to it. All we have to do now is go ahead and hit OK, and it is now exported. So let's go ahead and take a look at that. Take a look for it. And here we go. Swirls.lxs. All we have to do is double click. Luxrender automatically opens and begins rendering. Let's give this a couple of seconds just so that you can see that indeed we do have a glossy material here and a matte material here. And that's all there is to it, folks. Now, if we did have both lighting options enabled, the studio and the HDR, we could turn them off, turn one off or turn the other off as we see fit to see. And we can also later then export this by light group, etc. Just another option, to ease your scene setup. And that's all there is to it, folks. It's as easy as that, getting your StructureSynth scenes into Luxrender. So you've seen how to set up, how to install the exporter into StructureSynth. We've seen how to prepare our scene. We've seen what we need to do to get the proper materials and the proper primitives into Luxrender. We've seen how to export the scene, how to edit the scene, and the steps we needed to take for that. And we've seen how to get it into Luxrender. Thanks for joining me today on this StructureSynth to Luxrender exporter tutorial. Look forward to seeing you in another tutorial. Have a good one.